Buddha and Socrates changed everything, and neither wrote a word. In or around 399 BCE, a man drank poison in Athens. His friends were weeping. He told them to stop. His legs went numb, then his belly, then his chest, and then he was gone. That same year, possibly the year before, 4,000 miles east, another man lay down between two sal trees in a small town most people had never heard of. His closest student was crying behind a door. He called him back in. He said his final words, and then he was gone. Neither man had ever heard the other's name. They shared no language, no trade route, no messenger. They lived on opposite ends of the ancient world, separated by empires, deserts, and mountain ranges that wouldn't be crossed for another century. And yet, both spent their lives doing the same thing, asking questions, dismantling certainties, forcing everyone around them to think harder, look deeper, sit with discomfort. And neither wrote a single word. Everything you know about Socrates was written by someone else. Everything you know about the Buddha was remembered, recited, and written down generations later. Two men who changed the shape of human thought and left not one sentence in their own hand. Today, we're going to do something that history never allowed. We're going to put them in the same room, not to decide who was right, but to ask, what happens when the West's greatest questioner meets the East's deepest answer? And what if, at the very end, we discover they weren't giving different answers at all, but asking the same question from opposite ends of the human experience? Here's what makes this more than a thought experiment. Their methods were almost identical. Their deaths were almost mirrors. And the place where they diverge, that's where it gets dangerous. Because one of them believed thinking would set you free, and the other warned that thinking itself might be the cage. Let's start with the strangest coincidence in intellectual history. Act 1. The Parallels. The Axial Age. Two flames, one moment. The philosopher Karl Jaspers spent years staring at a problem that most historians had simply shrugged at, somewhere between 800 and 200 BCE, a window of about 6 centuries. Something happened to the human species, not in one place, everywhere, simultaneously. In China, Confucius and Laozi were rethinking society and nature. In Persia, Zarathustra was reimagining good and evil. In Israel, the great prophets were challenging their own kings. In Greece, the pre-Socratics were asking what the universe was made of. And in India, the Upanishadic sages, and then the Buddha, were dismantling the self. Jaspers called it the axial age, the axis around which human consciousness turned. And at the sharpest point of that axis, within a single generation, two men emerged who would define the method, not the content, the method of how human beings pursue truth. One in Athens, one in the Ganges Plain. Stephen Batchelor, who spent 40 years as a Buddhist monk before becoming one of the sharpest comparative thinkers alive, calls them fraternal twins, born from different mothers, shaped by different worlds, but unmistakably related. His question, which is now our question, related how? Let's begin with the most obvious parallel, and the one that turns out to be the most revealing. Act 1. The Parallels. They wrote nothing. This is not a minor biographical detail. This is a choice, and in both cases, a deeply strange one. Socrates lived in Athens, the most literate city in the ancient world. Writing was everywhere. Plays were performed, laws were inscribed, philosophical treatises circulated. Socrates' own students, Plato, Xenophon, were prolific writers. He could have written. He chose not to. Why? Because Socrates believed that truth happens between people. It happens in the live exchange, the question, the stumble, the contradiction, the recovery. Writing freezes thought. Dialogue keeps it alive. In the Phaedrus, Plato has Socrates compare writing to a painting. It looks like it's saying something, but if you ask it a question, it just stares back at you. Now, the Buddha. He lived in a culture with a strong oral tradition, but one that was beginning to write. The Brahmanical priests were already codifying hymns. Writing was available. And the Buddha had, by any account, an extraordinary capacity for systematic thought. The Abhidhamma tradition that grew from his teachings is one of the most intricate intellectual systems ever created. But he didn't write. His teachings begin with 4 words that tell you everything. Evam me sutam, thus have I heard. Not thus was it written, heard. Every sutta in the Pali Canon is a memory. Someone was in the room, someone listened, and then they told someone else. Here's what's interesting. We have a name for the problem this creates in Western philosophy: the Socratic problem. We can never fully separate what Socrates actually said from what Plato wanted him to say. Plato was a genius with his own agenda. How much of the Socrates we know is Socrates, and how much is Plato's projection? Buddhism has exactly the same problem. The canon wasn't written down until roughly 4 centuries after the Buddha's death. Councils were held, monks recited, disagreements arose, schools split. The Socratic problem and the Buddhist problem are the same problem. The problem of a teaching that lives in transmission, not transcription. And maybe that's not a bug. Maybe that's the point. Maybe both men understood something that we, in our age of screenshots and timestamps, have forgotten. That the most important truths aren't the kind you can pin to a page. They're the kind that only come alive when one person genuinely engages with another. Which brings us to the method. And the method is where things get electric. Act 1. The parallels. Questioning as weapon. You've probably heard of the Socratic method. A professor asks leading questions. A student stumbles toward understanding. It's become a cliché in law schools and TED Talks. But the real Socratic method, the one Socrates actually used on the streets of Athens, was not gentle, and it was not polite. It was an attack. Here's how it works. Socrates finds someone who claims to know something, a general who claims to know what courage is, a priest who claims to know what piety is, a politician who claims to know what justice is. And Socrates asks, "What is it? Define it." They define it. Socrates finds a contradiction. They revise. He finds another. They revise again and again until the person stands there, stripped of every certainty they walked in with, and admits, "I don't know." The Greeks had a word for it, elenchus, refutation, and the people of Athens had a less technical word, annoying. Socrates was not popular at dinner parties. Now watch this. There's a sutta, the Kulasakaka Sutta, MN 35, that reads like it was ripped from a Platonic dialogue. A man named Sakaka arrives. He's a professional debater. Think of him as the ancient Indian equivalent of a sophist, someone who argues for sport, for reputation, for the thrill of winning. He's heard about the Buddha, and he intends to crush him in public debate. 500 Lichavi nobles are watching. The stakes are real, and the Buddha does not lecture. He does not preach, he asks questions. Sakaka, when a king rules his domain, does he have sovereign power? Can he execute those who deserve execution, banish those who deserve banishment? Yes. Then tell me, do you have that kind of sovereign power over your own body? Can you command your body? Let my body be this way. Let my body not be that way. Silence. The Buddha keeps going. He pushes. He asks about feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. Do you control any of these? Can you command any of them? Sakaka is sweating. The text says he sat silent, his shoulders drooping, his head down, brooding, at a loss for words. And then the Buddha delivers the line that Socrates himself might have envied. What you said before does not agree with what you said later, and what you said later does not agree with what you said before. That is elenchus. That is the Socratic method, performed by the Buddha 4,000 miles from Athens in front of 500 witnesses against a man who thought he could win with words. But here's where it gets deeper. This isn't just technique. It's philosophy about technique. The Buddha didn't just ask questions instinctively. He had a formal taxonomy of questions, laid out in the Papañca Sutta, AN 4.42. 4 types. First, questions that deserve a direct answer. Is suffering real? Yes. Straight. Second, questions that need analytical unpacking. Is the self permanent? That depends on what you mean by self, what you mean by permanent, and which of the 5 aggregates you're pointing at. Third, questions that should be answered with a counter question. Someone asks, is consciousness material? And the Buddha asks back, what do you mean by consciousness? What do you mean by material? Exactly like Socrates responding to, what is courage? With, first tell me what you mean. And fourth, this is the one that has no parallel in Socrates. Questions that should be set aside entirely, not answered, not refuted, dismissed, because the question itself is malformed. It assumes a framework that doesn't hold. Is the self eternal or not eternal? The Buddha's answer, the question is wrong. It presupposes a self that either persists or doesn't. But that's not how it works. You're asking about the color of a unicorn's horn. Socrates never did this. Socrates would engage every question, even bad ones, especially bad ones. He'd wrestle them to the ground. The Buddha sometimes looked at a question, recognized it as a trap built into language itself, and simply walked past it. We'll come back to why that difference matters. It's the crack that opens into a canyon. But first, hold that, because there's a parallel that goes even deeper than method. It goes all the way to the floor of a prison cell and the shade of 2 flowering trees. Their deaths. Acti 2, the convergences, how they faced death. Let's go back to those 2 deaths, because the way these men died tells you almost everything about what they believed. Athens, 399 BCE, a prison cell. Socrates has been convicted. The charges, corrupting the youth, introducing strange gods, are political theater. Everyone in the room knows this. His real crime was making powerful people feel stupid in public for 30 years and refusing to stop. His friend Crito came with an escape plan, bribed guards, a boat to Thessaly, a comfortable exile. All Socrates had to do was walk out. He refused, not because he wanted to die, because he'd spent his entire life arguing that you should follow reason wherever it leads, even when it's inconvenient, especially when it's inconvenient. The laws of Athens raised him, educated him, gave him the ground to stand on. To flee now would make every argument he'd ever made a lie. So he stayed. The scene Plato gives us in the Phaedo is one of the most carefully observed deaths in all of literature. The jailer, a simple man, not a philosopher, comes in with the cup of hemlock and starts crying. He says Socrates is the noblest and gentlest man who's ever been in his custody. Socrates comforts him. Crito asks, "Can we wait? The sun hasn't set yet." Others who've been condemned drink as late as possible. They eat, they drink wine, some spend time with lovers. Socrates says, "Those men think they gain something by delaying. I think I'd gain nothing but my own contempt." He drinks, walks around the cell until his legs feel heavy, then lies down. The numbness creeps up, feet, shins, belly. His friends are sobbing. Socrates pulls the cloth from his face and says his last recorded words, "Crito, we owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay it and don't forget." A sacrifice to the god of healing, as though death itself were a cure. Now, India, roughly the same year, give or take one. Kusinara, a small town between two sal trees. The Buddha is 80 years old. He's been walking for months, teaching, even though his body is failing. He's eaten something that made him violently ill. The texts say it was either pork or truffles. The Pali word is ambiguous, and he knows this is the end. But watch what he does with his final hours, DN 16. 3 times the Buddha hints to his attendant Ananda, 3 times, that a fully awakened one could extend his life if asked. 3 times Ananda misses the cue, and the Buddha lets it go. He doesn't force the point. He doesn't blame Ananda. He simply accepts. Later, Ananda breaks down. He goes behind a door, leans against the frame, and weeps. "I'm still a learner with work to do, and my teacher is about to pass away, the one who was so compassionate to me." The Buddha sends someone to find him. "Bring Ananda here." And when Ananda comes, red-eyed, the Buddha doesn't scold him the way you might expect. He says something remarkably gentle. "Enough, Ananda. Don't grieve. Haven't I told you that all things dear to us must change and be separated from us?" Then, the final teaching. He turns to the assembled monks. 3 times he asks, "Does anyone have any doubt, any question, any uncertainty about the teaching? Ask now, so you won't later regret that you were face to face with the teacher and didn't ask." 3 times, silence, and his last words, "Vyadama Sankara, Apamadena Sampadetha." All conditioned things are subject to decay. Complete the work with diligence. Then, the texts say, he entered the first jhana, rose through the second, the third, the fourth, continued upward through the formless attainments, infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, neither perception nor non-perception. Then back down, 4th jhana, and from there, parinibbana. Sal trees that were out of season burst into bloom and dropped their flowers on his body. Now, step back. 2 deaths, 2 men who are completely calm, 2 men surrounded by weeping friends, 2 men who use their dying moments to teach. But the reason for their calm is entirely different. And this is where you have to pay attention, because this difference will crack open everything in Act 3. Socrates is calm because he believes something. In the Phaedo, he spends his last afternoon making arguments, rigorous philosophical arguments, that the soul is immortal. The soul existed before birth. It will exist after death. Death is simply the separation of soul from body. He's not guessing. He's reasoning his way to equanimity. Logos, rational argument, carries him through the door. The Buddha is calm for a completely different reason. He doesn't argue for an immortal soul. He's spent 45 years teaching that there is no fixed self to survive. His equanimity doesn't come from a belief about what happens next. It comes from having fully understood impermanence, not as a theory, but as a lived, embodied, seen through to the bottom truth. He isn't calm because he knows death isn't real. He's calm because he's already let go of everything death could take. One man reasons his way past death. The other has already dissolved what death threatens. Same composure, opposite foundations. Hold that. Act 2, the convergences. When the world pushed back. There's another convergence worth pausing on, because it tells you something about what happens when someone goes around dismantling certainties for a living. The world fights back. Socrates' trial wasn't an accident. He'd spent decades cross-examining the most respected men in Athens, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and publicly demonstrating that they didn't know what they thought they knew. The oracle at Delphi had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and Socrates, being Socrates, tried to disprove the oracle by finding someone wiser. He couldn't, not because he knew so much, but because everyone else didn't know they didn't know. That, he concluded, was the difference. He at least knew his own ignorance, noble insight, terrible political strategy. When you make a general look foolish in the agora, the general remembers. 500 jurors voted. 280 said guilty. A margin of 60 votes. 30 people changing their minds. And the history of philosophy goes differently. The Buddha faced a different kind of resistance, but the pattern is the same. A cousin named Devadatta tried to kill him, not metaphorically. He rolled a boulder down a hillside. He released a drunk elephant, Nalagiri, into the Buddha's path. The elephant, massive, enraged, charging through the streets of Rajagaha, came barreling toward the Buddha while everyone scattered. The Buddha didn't move. The text in the Kulavagga says he suffused the elephant with metta, loving kindness. Nalagiri slowed, stopped, lowered his trunk, and stood still. The crowd watched from rooftops. Socrates also didn't move, but for different reasons. When the jury vote came in, his friends expected him to do what every Athenian defendant did: plead, weep, bring his children to the stand, beg for mercy. He refused. He told the jury that he'd been the best thing that ever happened to Athens, a gadfly stinging a lazy horse into wakefulness. That if they killed him, they'd be hurting themselves more than him. In both cases, the confrontation reveals the teaching. The Buddha meets violence with a radically different quality of mind. Socrates meets injustice with a radically stubborn commitment to truth-telling. Both refuse to flinch, but one transforms the aggressor. The other provokes the aggressor further. And this leads to a convergence that sits right at the foundation of both traditions. The one that sounds simplest, but goes deepest. Act 2, the convergences. Knowing that you don't know Socrates' signature claim, the one that echoes through 25 centuries of Western philosophy, is this: I know that I know nothing, or more precisely, from the Apology. He is wiser than others only because, while they think they know things they don't, he at least knows he doesn't know. This is usually presented as intellectual humility, and it is that, but it's more. It's a method. Socrates is saying, the starting point of all real knowledge is the recognition that your current knowledge is unreliable. Strip away false certainty first. Then, and only then, can genuine understanding begin. Now here's what's remarkable. The Buddha's entire project starts in exactly the same place, but calls it something different and takes it somewhere radically different. The second link in the chain of dependent origination is avijja, ignorance. Not the absence of information, not the lack of data, but a fundamental misperception of reality, seeing permanence where there is change, seeing self where there is process, seeing satisfaction where there is suffering. Avijja isn't, "I don't know enough." It's, "I don't know that I'm seeing wrong." Do you hear the echo? Both men begin with the same diagnosis. The deepest human problem is that people don't know what they don't know. Both say, the beginning of wisdom is recognizing this condition. But watch where they go from here, because this is where the road forks. For Socrates, the cure for not knowing is more knowing. Better definitions, sharper reasoning, clearer concepts. The allegory of the cave says it plainly. You're trapped in shadows. The way out is up, toward the light of reason, toward the form of the good. Thinking, disciplined, relentless thinking, is the latter. For the Buddha, the cure for avijja is not more concepts. It's a different relationship to concepts altogether. In the Madhupindika Sutta, MN 18, the Buddha traces how contact leads to feeling, feeling to perception, perception to thinking, and thinking to papañca, conceptual proliferation. The mind doesn't just think about reality, it generates a reality made of concepts and then gets lost inside what it made. The problem isn't that you're thinking badly. The problem, at the deepest level, is that you're mistaking the thinking for the reality. Socrates would say, refine the instrument. Think harder, think better, think more precisely. The Buddha would say, at some point, you have to see that the instrument has limits, and what lies beyond those limits isn't reached by more of the same instrument. This isn't a small disagreement. This is a fault line that runs beneath the entire history of East-West thought. And in Act 3, we're going to walk right up to the edge of it. Because there's a moment, one specific, documented moment, where the Buddha did something Socrates never would have done. Something that, from a Socratic perspective, is almost unthinkable. He answered a question with silence. Act 3, the Great Divergence, the silence that changed everything. A wanderer named Vacchagotta came to the Buddha with a question, SN 44.10. It was not a complicated question. Philosophers had been asking it for centuries, and they'd keep asking it for millennia after. Vacchagotta simply asked, "Is there a self?" The Buddha said nothing. Vacchagotta tried again. Then, "Is there no self?" The Buddha said nothing. Vacchagotta got up and left. Afterwards, Ananda, who was always in the room, always listening, and frequently confused, asked the obvious question, "Why didn't you answer?" And the Buddha explained, "If I had said, 'There is a self,' I would have been siding with those who believe in an eternal, unchanging soul. And that would have blocked Vacchagotta from seeing impermanence. If I had said, 'There is no self,' I would have been siding with the annihilationists, and Vacchagotta would have thought his existing self was about to be destroyed. He'd have panicked. He'd have come away worse than he arrived. Both answers were wrong, not because the truth was somewhere in the middle, but because the question itself was built on a framework that couldn't hold reality. It assumed self was a thing that either existed or didn't, like a table, like a stone. And whatever self is or isn't, it doesn't work like that. So the Buddha chose silence. Now, try to imagine Socrates doing this. You can't. Socrates' entire existence was organized around the principle that every question deserves engagement. Every claim must be examined. The unexamined life is not worth living. Those are the words he chose to speak at his own death trial. Apology 38 or EA. He didn't say the unexamined life is difficult. He said it's not worth living. That's how seriously he took the act of questioning. If Vachagata had walked up to Socrates in the Athenian agora and asked, "Is there a self?" Socrates would have been delighted. He would have sat down, canceled his afternoon, and spent 3 hours asking Vachagata what he meant by self, what he meant by is, what he meant by there. He would have found contradictions. He would have pushed. He would have kept going until Vachagata either reached a new understanding or collapsed in confusion. And Socrates would have considered both outcomes productive. What Socrates would never have done is say nothing. Because for Socrates, silence isn't a teaching. It's the absence of teaching. It's a failure. For the Buddha, silence is the teaching. The fourth type of question in his taxonomy, AN 4.42, the kind that should be set aside, has no equivalent in the Greek tradition. There is no Socratic category for, this question is so fundamentally malformed that engaging it on its own terms will cause harm. Socrates believed you could always reason your way out. The Buddha recognized moments where reasoning itself was the trap you needed to step out of. And this is where the fault line opens. Act 3, the Great Divergence, the examined life and the awakened life. Let's put this plainly, because the difference sounds subtle, but it's actually enormous. Socrates offers the examined life. The Republic, the cave allegory, gives you the full architecture. You're a prisoner. You've been chained facing a wall since birth. Shadows flicker across the stone. You think the shadows are real. Then someone unchains you, turns you around, drags you up into the sunlight. Your eyes burn. You resist. But eventually, you see. You see the sun. You see reality as it actually is. And what is the mechanism that carries you from darkness to light? Logos, reason, dialectic. The relentless grinding process of questioning every assumption until the truth stands naked. The examined life is the life of ascent through reason. Now, the Buddha. The Buddha also says you're trapped. But the trap isn't just that you're seeing shadows instead of reality. The trap is the way you're looking. The mind that grasps, categorizes, builds concepts, and then clings to those concepts as though they were solid. That mind is doing something that no amount of better grasping will fix. The Madhupindika Sutta, MN 18, lays this out with surgical precision. A sensory contact occurs. Say, you see something. Immediately, feeling arises. From feeling, perception. From perception, thinking. And from thinking, papañca, conceptual proliferation. The mind spins out stories, categories, judgments, identities. I am the one who sees. That is the thing I see. I like it. I want more. This is mine. And here's the key. Papañca isn't bad thinking. It's not sloppy reasoning that better reasoning can correct. It's what happens when thinking itself operates under the illusion that the thinker is a fixed, permanent entity navigating a world of fixed, permanent objects. The root of papañca, the Sutta Nipata says it explicitly, SN 4.14, is I am the thinker. Do you see the problem this creates for Socrates? Socrates says, question everything. The Buddha says, yes. But at some point, you must also question the questioner. And when you do, when you turn the lens on the one holding the lens, you discover there's no fixed one there. There's a process, a flow, an arising and passing that doesn't need and has never needed a permanent self at the center. Socrates' examined life runs on logos, and logos requires a self doing the examining, a thinker thinking, a questioner questioning. Without that self, the whole engine stalls. The Buddha's awakened life runs on vipassana, direct seeing. And what you see, when you look closely enough, is that the self you thought was doing the examining was itself a construction. Not nothing, but not what you thought it was. Not a thing, a process. Here's one way to feel the difference. Socrates finds a man who says he knows what justice is. Socrates asks questions. The man's certainty collapses. Socrates has done his job. The man now knows he doesn't know. He can start fresh, rebuild with better materials. The Buddha finds a man who says he knows who he is. The Buddha asks questions, as he does with Sakaka, MN 35. But the questions don't just collapse the man's answers. They collapse the one who was answering. The five aggregates are not self. Form, not self. Feeling, not self. Perception, not self. Formations, not self. Consciousness, not self. You can't rebuild with better materials because the builder was the illusion. One peels away false knowledge to find true knowledge. The other peels away the knower. Act 3. The Great Divergence. The Teacher's Paradox. There's a beautiful irony buried in both traditions, and it's worth surfacing because it shows just how deep the parallel runs, even inside the divergence. Socrates claims to know nothing. That's his whole position. He has no doctrine, no system, no teachings to transmit. He's just a man asking questions, and yet, he is the most influential teacher in the history of Western civilization. The man who says, "I have nothing to teach you," taught everyone. The Buddha does the opposite. He claims to have found something, a specific, articulable path, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, the three characteristics. He lays it out in systematic detail. He builds a sangha, ordains monks, gives thousands of discourses. And yet, his constant instruction is, don't take my word for it. Test it, verify it, experience it yourself. The Kalama Sutta is the most famous expression, but it's everywhere. The man who has the most to teach keeps telling his students to stop relying on teachers. Socrates, "I know nothing, believe me." The Buddha, "I know the way, don't believe me, walk it." Both are caught in the same paradox, and both seem completely comfortable inside it, as though the paradox itself is part of the teaching. Act 3. The Great Divergence. What if they met? So, here we are. Two methods, two visions of what liberation looks like, and a question that's been building since we started. Is the examined life the same as the awakened life, or are they fundamentally, irreconcilably different? Let's resist the temptation to resolve this cleanly, because the honest answer is, we don't know, and both men would probably respect that honesty. But we can push a little further. Imagine Socrates sits with the Buddha. He does what he always does. He asks questions. What is the self? What is suffering? What is liberation? The Buddha might engage, as he did with Sakaka, as he did with hundreds of interlocutors across 45 years. He was not allergic to dialogue. He was brilliant at it. But at some point, Socrates would push to the place he always pushes. Define it. Give me the logos. Give me the form. Give me the rational account that I can hold, examine, and test against contradiction. And the Buddha would reach the moment he reached with Vacchagotta, the moment where the question has been followed as far as language and logic can take it, where the next step isn't a better answer, it's a different kind of knowing entirely, not logos, not rational articulation, but direct seeing, first person, non-conceptual. And Socrates, what would Socrates do? Would he say, "That's not knowledge, that's mysticism. Show me the argument or you have nothing"? Or would he, the man who always said he knew nothing, would he be curious? That's what I keep coming back to, not whether Socrates would agree with the Buddha, but whether his own principle, "I know that I know nothing," would, if followed honestly, all the way down, lead him past the boundary of logos itself. Whether the truly examined life, examined without flinching, eventually examines the examiner and arrives by a Western road at something the Eastern road reached 25 centuries ago. Maybe the examined life and the awakened life aren't two different destinations. Maybe they're two different starting points, leading to the same mountain seen from opposite valleys. Or maybe not. Maybe the difference is real and irreducible, and that's okay too. Maybe what matters isn't the resolution. Maybe what matters is that two men 4,000 miles apart, without a single written word between them, both insisted that the unquestioned life is the only one not worth living, and gave everything they had, including their lives, to prove it. Act 3. The Great Divergence. Coda. Two men, no words. We began with two deaths. Let's end there. A prison cell in Athens. Late afternoon. The light is coming in low. Socrates has spent his last day doing what he always did. Talking, arguing, pushing his friends to think harder about the soul, about death, about what it means to live a life worthy of a human being. He has not wasted a single hour. He has reasoned right up to the edge. The hemlock arrives. He drinks it the way you might drink water after a long walk, simply without ceremony. His friends fall apart. Apollodorus, who had been weeping all day, breaks into a wail. Socrates looks up and says, "What is this strange outcry? I sent the women away so that they would not behave like this. I've heard one should die in silence. Be quiet and have patience." Even dying, he's teaching. Even dying, he believes the right words, the right frame, can bring order to chaos. Logos to the last breath. The numbness rises. Feet, legs, abdomen. He pulls the cloth from his face one final time. A debt owed to Asclepius, the god who heals the sick. As though what was happening to him was not an execution, but a cure. As though the body had been the illness all along, and this was the recovery, then silence. The Phaedo says, "Such was the end of our companion, a man who, we would say, was the best, the wisest, and the most just of all the men of his time." The 4,000 miles east, a grove of sal trees. The Buddha has been walking for days, possibly weeks, though his body is failing. He's passed through towns, given final teachings, eaten that last meal. By the time he reaches Kusinara, he's ready, DN 16. He asks Ananda to prepare a couch between two sal trees, head to the north. He lies down on his right side, one hand under his head, and even now, especially now, he teaches. A wanderer named Subhada comes with questions. The monks try to turn him away. The teacher is tired. This isn't the time. The Buddha overhears and says, "Let him in." Subhada asks his questions. The Buddha answers. Subhada becomes the last person to be ordained in the Buddha's presence. Then the monks. 3 times the question, any doubt, any confusion, anything at all? Silence. Not the silence of indifference, the silence of people who know they are watching the end of something unrepeatable and cannot find language adequate to the moment. Vayadama sankhara, apamadena sampadeta. All conditions fall apart. Do the work carefully, and then that extraordinary journey inward. First jhana, second, third, fourth, up through the formless realms, infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, the realm of neither perception nor non-perception. Then back down again, fourth jhana, and from there, the texts simply say, he attained final nibbana. Sal trees bloomed out of season. Flowers fell on his body like the world itself was trying to say something it didn't have words for. 2 deaths, 2 silences. One man who spent his whole life talking, who believed that language, properly used, could carry you all the way to truth, ends in silence because the body simply stops. One man who knew that language had limits, who once answered the deepest question with no words at all, ends in silence because he has gone where words were never designed to follow. And between those 2 silences, that space is perhaps the most important territory in the history of human thought. The territory between the examined life and the awakened life, between the mind that questions everything and the mind that questions even itself, between logos and liberation. We said at the beginning that we'd put these 2 men in the same room, and we've done that. We've watched them agree on almost everything that matters, that most people are asleep, that unexamined certainty is the root of suffering, that the truth is worth more than comfort, that you should never stop asking questions, that you should face death without flinching. And we've watched them diverge on the one thing that might matter most. What happens when questioning reaches its own limit? When the examined life has examined everything, including the examiner? Socrates would say, keep going, there's always another question. Logos has no ceiling. The Buddha might smile and say nothing. I don't know who's right. I don't think that's the point. The point is that 2 human beings, born on opposite sides of a world that didn't know it was one world, both looked at the human condition and refused to accept it as given. Both said, you can do better than this. You can see clearer. You can live deeper. And both paid for that insistence with everything they had. Neither wrote it down. And we're still talking about them. Maybe that's the final lesson. Not what they said, but what they didn't say. What they trusted us to figure out for ourselves. 2 empty pages, 2 open invitations, still waiting after 25 centuries for you to pick up where they left off.